What's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. Today's video is about how freaking hard learning is. What are you going to do about that as a course creator? In today's video, I'm going to teach you about elastic learning. How can you get more students, more transformations? I'm Andrew Barry, welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to kick things off with Bruce Lee. Be like water, my friends.
This is what it is, okay? I said empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. Now you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it in a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Now water can flow or it can crash. Be water, my friend.
What Bruce Lee was talking about here was resisting pressure. And in learning, there's a lot of pressure. There's a thing called the dip. If you can imagine, we've got this graph of your learning, and there's always a beginning part where you start to learn quite a bit. And then it sort of plateaus for a while. And it's at this point that it doesn't feel like you're actually learning something until you kind of get over that dip and you start to accelerate again. And it's this part that we're going to talk about today. How do you get your students over that dip? So diamonds resist pressure by being the hardest substances on earth and not giving into it. Rubber resists pressure by giving into it and changing shape to accommodate the pressure before ultimately springing back to its original shape. Diamonds are very rare, but we can learn a lot from rubber. Elastic learning is not about increasing flexibility, it's about increasing resilience to pressure. And that's the pressure of learning, of taking your brain out of its comfort zone and learning and practicing new things. So before we dive into elastic learning and the pillars and principles that underpin that, we're going to first start talking about consistency and motivation. All right, my friends, consistency is the name of the game. In learning, we talked about the comfort zone and how you're always going to find yourself outside of that comfort zone. Your students are going to find that too. And what you've got to be laser focused on is getting consistent practice for them. More than consistent practice, it's consistent goal achievements. This will become extremely important a little bit later on, because consistent goal achievements are often thought about as powering through adversity, where it's actually about making consistency easy. It's about setting your marks low enough to still be challenging, but to make sure that you hit them. It's about creating mini habits. Like if you wanted to start exercising, start with a mini habit of 1 push-up a day, and maybe make a stretch habit 10 push-ups a day, and an elite goal maybe 100 push-ups a day. What this allows you to do is to build consistency into your routine. And that's that consistency of practice. And if we tie in some of the concepts of deliberate practice that we've talked about in previous videos, you then get accelerated learning, which compounds over time. So this idea of consistency ties into the second concept we need to discuss first, which is motivation. Now, those of you who've been following along on this channel will remember that we've talked about motivation before, so check the comments below for a link to the video on how to stoke motivation in learning. Today, I want to add to that with 2 key components of motivation, which will be important when we start to develop our concept of elastic learning. The 2 components here are attainability and action value. Attainability is what we talked about when we were talking about consistency. It's that we set the goal at just the right level to push us a little bit out of our comfort zone, but ensure that we can actually do it on a consistent daily basis. Action value is determined by our perceived pain or reward from taking the action. And the sweet spot that we're looking for here is the peak level of attainability and the peak level of action value, where those 2 intersect. That sweet spot is where the goal is an easily attainable and slightly rewarding step forward. So let's go back to the push-up example. If 1 push-up is not going to add any value to you, then that shouldn't be your baseline goal. Maybe then 10 is the beginning. And that represents some small step forward for you, but it's still easily attainable. And that's your baseline. And from there, you build on top of it. So in thinking about your online course, what is easily attainable and still slightly rewarding step forward for your students? And think about that on every single step of the journey. Okay, now we're going to talk about giving verticality to these habits. So we've talked about setting the baseline, and what economists have found is that the quality of a given option, that baseline of say 10 push-ups a day, the quality of that given option cannot be assessed in isolation from its alternatives. So it's very important that we stack on top of that a goal that's a little bit more of a stretch and then a goal that's a much bigger stretch. That those are still within the spectrum of attainability, but the reward and the step forward is bigger and bigger at each level. What this translates to for the learner is that these choices become non-trivial. On a difficult day, the choice to take the easiest option keeps the streak alive and keeps them engaged. Super important to keep them in your flywheel of learning. And on a high motivation day, the opportunity to get a big win keeps them energized and engaged and wanting to push themselves further and further forward. These elastic habits of learning introduce choice in an area that desperately needs it. It's worth pointing out here that a lot of these ideas come from this book, Elastic Habits by Stephen Guise. If you want to ever dive deeper into this, and it has a ton of applicability to your own personal life and your own habits and routines, I highly recommend this book. But let's get back to elastic learning. Adapting some concepts from the book, there are 5 principles to elastic learning that I want to cover. The first is intelligent tracking. Then we have simple and lightweight execution. Then we have what is called the life-aware methodology. Then we get lateral flexibility, and finally vertical flexibility. So let's break each one of these down quickly. Intelligent tracking is giving your students a means to track the inputs into their future goals of the course. So this very important distinction between input goals and output goals. An output goal would be something like grow this YouTube channel to 1,000 subscribers so I can finally start monetizing these videos, which are happening without me, by the way. Whereas an input goal would be to make 52 videos this year, which is what my goal is. Input goals are much easier to control, and if done right, should lead to the outcome goal. So think of ways to give your students abilities to track their inputs into the process of learning. Simple and lightweight execution is just basically making it super easy for your students to complete exercises, assignments, homework, whatever it is you're giving them. Any complexity in terms of different places they have to go or new tools that they have to learn or anything like that make it much harder for them to actually take action. So you want to reduce all the friction as much as possible so that they can just go in, take action, and then do what they need to do with that. Maybe it's to share it online, maybe it's to share it within your community for feedback. So think about the friction points on that journey and try and remove as many of them as you can. The life-aware methodology basically just acknowledges the fact that life is chaotic. It's busy, it's hectic, things get in the way. There is really no such thing as a perfect day. And so the great thing about elastic learning is that it's kind of built into the systems. So by having mini goals, you've got this safety net for people. So instead of thinking of it as like this tedious task that they have to take every single day, they can now look at the 3 options, and we're going back to that optionality. And if it's a busy, chaotic day or the motivation just happens to be low, they can look at that last one as a safety net and say, I can still keep the streak alive and I'm still taking action, but it's not causing me unnecessary stress. So lateral flexibility, again, built into the system. So if it's an exercise routine, for example, on a rest day, you could still keep the streak alive in terms of being active by going for a walk or going for a light swim or something like that, where it's not, you're being active, but you're not necessarily doing the same intensity of workout that you did the day before or the week before that. So with a normal goal, when it's a single goal or a single learning activity, not doing that thing can feel like a failure, can feel like breaking your streak. And so this gives people the option to say, all right, today's not that day. We get some lateral flexibility in what we're learning. And then we've got vertical flexibility, which is just as important as lateral flexibility, and that is that elastic learning can expand and contract from spectacular highs to moderate mediums to light lows that don't feel like failures. There's a bit of two-way leverage here because you can reference the large option to make the small option feel easy and doable. And you can then reference the small option to make the large option feel like a big win or a big achievement. So these are the 5 principles that underpin elastic learning. Let's now dive into how to set this up in your course. So there are going to be 4 pillars for this. Let's quickly look at what those are. The first pillar is that elastic learning should be done every day. The second is that elastic learning should have a limited number of lateral and vertical options. The third pillar is that elastic learning should be tracked. And the fourth pillar is that you shouldn't have more than 3 elastic learning habits at any given time. So let's dive into that with an example. So I'm creating a course on creating online courses, and a component of that is to design your curriculum. Now, having gone through this in deep detail myself, it's incredibly hard to do. So one way to think about this is every day have accountability groups in your course for people to work on their curriculum. So for people to meet one-on-one or in groups of 2 to 3, maybe 4, no more than that for accountability groups, you can get them to meet and have them self-organize and just basically work on their curriculums. The beauty of working in a group is there is accountability, which is obviously in the name, but also an opportunity to get live feedback on what you're thinking. Right, so the second pillar is to have a limited number of success points, basically. And the recommended number is 3. Anything more than that makes the relativity benefit of those 3 options and those 3 choices somewhat more confusing. It's like when you go to a shop and you see 17 different types of milk. Very difficult to suddenly decide what type of milk you want to get. So giving people 3 options for what success could look like with a given project. This is the key thing. So my project would be in this course to create a curriculum. And so everyone's doing the same project, but we're going to give people 3 different tiers of what success looks like. So for example, an outline of your curriculum, maybe one example, or the first tier. So you've just sort of outlined the steps that you're going to cover. The second may be to have one of those modules broken out into more detailed lessons. And then finally, the third might be to have all of them broken out into detailed lessons. And if you really want to stretch, this isn't a 4th one, but maybe you can add that to the 3rd, is to have learning outcomes for each of those lessons. So there's 3 different ways that people at various points of course creation can actually make successful outcomes of the same assignment. Now you need to give people an option to track it. And with this, it would be a simple case of creating a template and having people use that template. Or if they want to use their own template, if they're familiar with that, have a place for them to post it in your community. This is a great way for people to hold themselves accountable, for you to track that the work is getting done, for you to help troubleshoot as it's getting done, and just for others to then give each other feedback. And finally, having no more than 3 of these at a given time. So we've talked about before on this series that we can only hold in our heads 3 to 5 things in working memory. And that is why the recommendation for elastic habits and elastic learning is to not have more than 3 of these going at the same time. For my On Deck Course Creator Fellowship, we'll probably have 1 main assignment every single week. And you can maybe break those out into 3 separate assignments or 3 components of an assignment. But anything more than that becomes too confusing. Right, so those were the 4 pillars for setting it up. I hope you found that helpful and have some ideas now for your course. If you do, please share them in the comments below. This is an evolving idea in my head. I'd love to hear from you how you're thinking about it. To end this video off, let's talk about a little bit more of the psychology of this. Maybe a few more tips in here to help you come up with what those elastic learning habits look like for your course. So one of the things I love talking about is being in the mind of the student. Student-centered learning design. So it really requires, first of all, that you've spent a lot of time talking to students, And secondly, that you can practice empathy to put yourself in their shoes. And when coming up with elastic learning habits, one of the first things to think about as you're visualizing what it's like to be in their shoes is to think, what level of achievement would I be proud of today? That's the level that if they hit, they'll be feeling really good about themselves and they'll be motivated to want to keep moving forward and keep engaging with the course content. If you set the top level too high, you'll find that people just end up producing a lot of the middle and bottom level, and you're not ever actually going to hit that top level. So with the top level, really focus on the attainability. It should be the biggest stretch that can actually be attained in the given time frame that you're giving people. Right, so there you have it. The elastic learning habits methodology. This is a developing idea that I've been working on for not too long. So I'd love to know how this resonates with you and how you can apply this in your course. Put in some comments below. I respond to all of them. Love to learn more from you. And I will see you next week for another video on how to teach on the internet.